Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, weiss-sound.com and Weiss Advice here on YouTube. I'm going to be discussing my signature 808 technique. Now, I did a video on this about 10 years ago, and when I did it, got about 150,000 to maybe 200,000 views, and has since been taken down, but I'm going to put it up again. We're going to see how well this technique has aged. So, let's play a little bit of this record right here. So obviously this is a pretty 808 driven record. I think that's self-explanatory. Let's dissect the 808 a little bit and discuss even what an 808 is. So at the heart of things, an 808 is just a shaped sine wave that comes from the sub-range. There's really not that much that's all that crazy about it. The core of the 808 ends up being all the stuff that's below 100 hertz. This is basically the heart of it right here. Right, that's the generator. But what makes the 808 interesting is everything that happens above that, what's called the harmonics or the overtones. And that comes from the distortion that's incurred along the way in the signal processing, whether it's just the inherent distortion of running out of your 808 machine into a tape or through a console or wherever it's gone before it was turned into a sample, or if it's purposeful distortion like added distortion from some kind of a plugin or piece of hardware or something like that. And that stuff is all happening above our fundamental sine wave, happening maybe about here. That's the good stuff. That's the character. That's the intrigue and the interest. That's what gives the 808 its personality, not the fundamental tone. It's the distortion profile. So when I'm working on an 808, I'm really thinking about that quality and that character. And I think the heart of my signature technique and the way that you can create your own version of doing what I'm doing is by focusing on the distortion character of the 808 and how we're going to manipulate it, or how we're going to choose not to manipulate it, because sometimes 808s are just best left alone. And in fact, in this record, I would actually go as far as to say this would be one of those times. But it wouldn't be much of a tutorial if I was like, so there's my signature technique, you don't do anything, right? Well, I just want to put the aside in there that a very, very high percentage of the time, especially nowadays, that 808s have really been sound designed and many different perfect 808s have been put into sample packs. I would say a large portion of the time I'm not doing anything to the 808 at all. However, let's show what I would do if, say, I wanted to bring out the character of the 808. Well, we know the character of the 808 is above the fundamental range, so we could simply just EQ it up, right? There's nothing wrong with taking the simple route. I don't hate that. That actually sounds great. We could even be a little bit more specific about it. I really like those higher tones and maybe less of the mid tones, so maybe something more like this. Gives it a little bit of bite, a little bit of aggression in an otherwise mellow song. We could maybe take down just a little bit of that super high range hair that's showing up. Nice. That's a great way to transform it if we wanted a little bit more of the character out there. But let's say we wanted the whole of the character, right? You notice I moved higher in the frequency range. Part of the reason I did that is because the punch of the 808 is kind of living in the same place that the distortion character of the 808 is living. So if I start pushing up too much of the lower mids to upper bass tones, we start getting this overly punchy 808 that kind of overloads the record. Right, we're just eating the record alive at this point. So the way that I like to do it is to control the punch of the 808 and kind of keep it where it's living. That's kind of how I set my balance for the 808. Like, okay, this is the perfect amount of punch, but now let's listen to the sustain, where the overtones are living, where that distortion profile is living. Can we control the punch and keep it where it's at, while at the same time pushing that distortion forward? And that's where I bring in a multiband compressor. Now, I like to use the FabFilter Pro MB, but that said, you do not have to use this plugin. It's like everything I do on this channel. I tend to work in Pro Tools, and I tend to use certain plugins like FabFilter Pro MB, but it's the idea that's important, not the actual specifics of what you're doing. There's no reason you couldn't do this in Logic using the Waves C6 or something like that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create my band that highlights just the distortion profile that I like. So typically it'll be a pretty wide band like this, and I can audition it. Right, that might be a general go-to, but let's say that, you know, this record has a sort of R&B-ish feel. Maybe I want to make it a little bit warmer, so I'll cut out some of the like higher, grungier tones. And just focus on the warmest parts of the 808 distortion. That really just comes down to taste. In this particular case, I'm going to sort of split the difference here, and really it's all hypothetical anyway. I might not even end up doing this for this record. I just want to demonstrate the technique. So what I want to do is I want to start keeping the punch in check while bringing up all of the sustain. So the way that I'm going to do that is basically, however, I'm going to set the threshold on my multiband to where I'm catching the punch, but not catching any of the sustain. And then from there, the amount of gain reduction that I do to the punch is going to be equivalent to the amount of makeup gain that I give the band. Slightly confusing phraseology if you're not used to the terms here, but basically what I'm doing is I'm figuring out how much of the distortion profile I want to push up, and then I'm reducing the punch by the same amount. So we can work it two ways. We can either figure out how much distortion we want, which we're going to need to do in the record, and then start reducing the punch, or we could start reducing the punch and then start pushing it up. Either way, it doesn't really matter. So right about here at about plus 4 dB, the distortion starts to kind of compete with the piano. That's probably about where I would want to put it, because the question is, you know, what's going to take precedent, the piano or the distortion? And in this particular, or the 808, I should say, in this particular case, they're kind of both equally important in the record, which sort of makes it a little hard to suss out, but I'm going to set it so that the 808 and the piano are kind of competing with each other for now. Now, if I'm doing about 4 dB of gain, I want to reduce the punch by about 4 dB of gain. This will keep the transient energy locked into the same place I had it before I started doing this boost. So here the meters here are telling me that it's doing the right amount of reduction, but it doesn't really sound like it, and that's because I have my release set really fast. So I'm gonna have to slow my release down in order to actually hear that punch stay contained. And one of the things that's really cool is I can even time the release a little bit so that it creates this like bowing sense in the 808. So instead of it going bum, 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 it's going bum, 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 like with a little bit of lift in the middle. That gives it a little bit of arc inside of the 808 itself, which creates a nice feel sometimes. So just an aside there, but one of the benefits of doing it this way. If I set the release too far, it's usually pretty obvious, and then I can kind of rein it back into where I get that nice little rhythmic bowing. Yeah, about there. In this particular case, I've got the release set actually pretty far here, so something to keep in mind. And let's do a little bit more reduction. And then lastly, we might want to fine tune the attack just to let a little bit of the punch come through. Even though it's going to exaggerate the punch a touch, I just don't want to overly round the sound through the compression. So, slowing the attack ever so slightly might help. Great, let's take it out of audition mode, let's throw it into oversampling, and let's listen to that. Now, let's bypass this and just try and focus on the punch of the 808. Let's see if we moved it or not. We kind of kept the punch in the same place. It sounds like maybe we got like a half dB more punch kind of hanging out. Hard to tell, but it's really right in the same range. But the 808 sounds a lot bigger because all of the sustain has been pushed forward. If we pull this up, we can always check the meters just to kind of see what story they're telling. Let's take a look at our peaks. Yeah, so we got like half a dB more punch. Let's turn it down a little bit. Let's change our output level. Let's try like a whole dB. Let's see how that feels. Nope, it's like half a dB. All right. There we go. All right, cool. So let's do a before and after. Let's figure out where we're at. And you'll notice that when we bring this in, even though the 808 is about the same size, we end up with an 808 that kind of sounds a little bit bigger and has more of a note to it. And this is what I like about this technique, because we're sort of moving the energy from that fundamental tone into a higher part of the 808. And this can be helpful in a number of ways. First of all, our ear is not going to hear subtone nearly as loudly as it's going to hear the same amount of energy at a higher tone. So by shifting the energy higher, it actually makes it sound louder. So we get a bigger 808. And as long as there's enough weight still in the fundamental tone, it's going to have plenty of bass. We're not going to have any problem with it. The other thing is that not all sound systems are really going to recreate sub. If we're listening on laptop speakers, if we're listening on earbuds, if we're listening on small cones, we're not going to get the same kind of sub energy that we would get if we were like in a car with a sub or in a home theater system that had, big cone speakers or something like that. And so for most playback environments, we're actually going to get a more consistent and a bigger sound because we've shifted the energy into a range that most speakers are going to reproduce a little bit more easily. On top of that, we've also brought out the character of the 808. So there's a lot of wins coming in across the board here. I'm not even convinced that this is really that much louder. I think I'm going to negotiate the output here. I think I'm going to turn this output down a little bit to like 3 dB. All right, so our before and after. So in a box, I like this. I think that I would probably keep the 808 kind of more like this, and I would possibly get the piano out of the way, darken the piano a little bit, open things up. The only concern I would have is that because there's now a lot of stuff that's happening in that lower mid-range, how is that going to translate once the vocals come into that record, right? Because if the vocals come in and suddenly everything's crammed up into like that 200 to 500 hertz range, then we're going to get a muddy record where because everything's big, everything ends up sounding small. So it's an idea to maybe not do this if there's too much stuff happening there, but it's negotiable, and I think that with or without this, the record is going to end up sounding pretty big because it's also a pretty open sounding record. So again, you have to use discretion as to when you want to change something, no matter what technique you're using. But if you do want to bring out the character of the 808 while controlling the punch, which we very frequently do, this is a really great way to do it. So the move, one more time, is selecting your band on a multi-band compressor, highlighting just the tone that you're trying to bring out, which is usually in the upper bass to lower, like top of the lower mid slash, maybe into the upper mids, depending, and then controlling the punch by compressing the attack of the 808 while allowing the sustain and all the tone to come forward. Alright guys, if you dig this video, hit that like button. If you like what I'm doing here on this channel, hit subscribe with the bell notification so that you can get notified. If you have any questions about this technique and you want me to discuss it further, drop something in the comments section below. Or if there's just anything that you'd like to see me do a demonstration of, drop something in the comments section below. Actually, if you just want to say hi, drop something in the comments section below. Alright, lastly, we are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.